Welcome to Minds Worth Meeting, Zoe. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Whitney.
And the office is abuzz with Zoe just gave us a fantastic workshop with our entire company, and we learned so much. We got to practice being influential from one of the best in the business. And this episode will air during Women's History Month, so you're the reboot episode, and I think it's so timely for Women's History Month. So thank you so much for being with us.
Absolutely honored. Thank you.
So let's just get into how you became a marketer. Tell us about your background, how you started, what got you to this point?
I guess I got interested in influence originally because I was so shy and uninfluential. And as a kid, I was super nerdy, so I had a theory that the reason people talked over me when I spoke was that my voice was the same timbre as the ambient sounds of the universe. And it was frustrating to not be heard, and so I started doing theater. And then as I learned how to communicate and became better at it, just for money because my family was poor, started working in sales. And having a theater background and working in sales, you can do well,
right?
Because you know how to connect with people. So it just started with very unimpressive jobs like door-to-door sales, and then after I started a business and went to business school, I ended up working in marketing, and I was a brand manager for Mattel on Barbie for a while, which was much more fun and interesting. I did some political stuff. One of the things that I really would revise if I could live my life over again was helping manage Ralph Nader's presidential campaign in Colorado right when I got out of college. That was pretty bad. I didn't know what I was doing, so it's not like I caused Al Gore to lose that election. But
Not your fault.
But yeah, and then I became really interested in understanding the science of how does influence work. So I went back to grad school and started doing research in behavioral economics.
I totally identify with being shy.
Really?
I was a ballerina when I was a kid, and my first recital, I didn't actually want to be on stage, so I hid behind the girl in front of me, and that was part of the performance. So I get that, and I have to admit this episode is probably very selfish because we're an agency of marketers and communicators, so we want to be more influential. So these tactics and these strategies that you have, everyone's excited to learn more and to dig into your book.
Can I ask you, do you still feel shy, or have you gotten over that?
No, I haven't gotten over it.
Really?
Still, yeah, very much.
But you choose to do an on-camera podcast.
Yep. Take one for the team.
Kudos to you.
Thank you. So the focus of your expertise is influence and decision-making. Why that part specifically?
My very strong belief is that what stands between us and doing all of the things that we want to do and having the impact that we want to have is our ability to influence and persuade other people. This is something that when we're tiny, we're born with it. It's in our DNA, and small children are incredibly influential. But then for almost all of us, at some point during our formative years, these well-intentioned parents and teachers train us to play nice and play small and not take up too much space. And we end up holding ourselves back. And we also, a lot of people that you and I work with, end up developing good student habits where we work hard and we wait to be recognized and rewarded, and we just don't realize that we actually have to also be advocating on behalf of ourselves and other people.
Right. Yeah. So your book was released just over a year ago. I loved it. And on my second round of listening to the audiobook, and I appreciate that you did the voice, the reading for the audiobook, because it was phenomenal. I loved doing it. So what, and the book is based on your very popular course at Yale. What went into writing that book? What did you... What kind of journey was that?
Oh, so many blood, sweats, and tears. And many years And also a lot of help. So I had 3 research assistants.
Wow.
I had a writing partner working with me. I had an editor that I hired in addition to the editor at Random House who worked with me. And I had 2 agents who are very helpful. So it's my work, but it's very much a group project. And I started it over at least 3 times. And the last time I started it over was when the pandemic hit and the lockdown happened.
Right.
I was 4 months away from turning in the manuscript. And then Random House, thank you Random House forever, and my editor Hillary there, they realized, okay, we don't know what's happening, what is going to go on when we launch books into this uncertain world. And they gave me an extra year. And they said,
Oh, wow.
we don't need your book right now. You can have an extra year. So I took the whole manuscript, threw it away, and I started over and I rewrote it, and that was my pandemic project. So the book that you have was my pandemic project that I worked on since there wasn't a lot of speaking going on. We weren't doing a lot of work together.
Right.
And the book that came as it is now, I'm very proud of, and I love it, and it's very much deeper and more real and authentic than I think there was a Pollyanna-ish tone to the previous iteration.
If I remember correctly, one of the original titles was Influence for Nice People.
Yeah, I always hated that title, so that wasn't my title. That was my agent's title.
Okay.
She's Canadian, and we joked with her that it's Influence for Canadians. But that does describe still the content of the book, and it is who I've written the book for.
Yeah.
For smart, nice people who are reluctant to study and exercise influence. And and these are my favorite people. And so what happens is if we're not wanting to study and practice influence, we just leave the world in the hands of the power-hungry people who have no qualms about it.
Because influence can feel yucky sometimes. It can feel almost manipulative. So how do we kind of like take our minds out of that and say, I can actually use this for good?
Yeah, it can absolutely feel and be manipulative. There's nothing inherently good or bad about influence. It's like power, and you could think of it like electricity, and it could turn on the lights in a school
Energy.
or power an electric chair. And there's no valence, positive or negative, to influence, but there's a lot of problems that happen when we focus on the negative side, because then we feel like we shouldn't be part of it, and we shouldn't have it, and we shouldn't do it, rather than saying manipulative people can use influence, and great people with great ideas can use influence, and it's the same similar skills that we need to make the things happen and bring people on board. So I'm really hoping and working on shifting the way that we think and talk about influence to be something that people of good character and good intent can do to make great things happen.
Right. Wonderful. And so behavioral economics, it takes into account our psychology and how we react to stimuli in the outside world. Can you tell us about the gator and the judge? Because I thought this was such a fantastic way to think about how our brains work and how when we communicate with other people, what will grab their attention. So can you tell us about the gator and the judge?
Yeah, sure. And for anyone listening who's not familiar with behavioral economics, it is really psychology. It's just, I don't know, somebody started calling it economics because you can get Nobel Prizes in economics. So actually at least 3 or 4 behavioral economists have won Nobel Prizes. That's my theory. The fundamental framework in behavioral economics is called, in our discipline, System 1 and System 2. And people who might be familiar with books like Thinking Fast and Slow by one of those Nobel Prize winners, Danny Kahneman, this is what he's talking about, the fast and the slow. And I use the analogy of the gator and the judge because a concrete analogy takes into account the way that we think and process information. So the gator piece, which is System 1, is this unconscious, and it's fast, instantaneous, nearly effortless system that is driving the majority of our thinking and the majority of our behavior. Anything that through practice becomes habitual becomes something that we can do essentially mindlessly. Like if you drive, you can drive a car mindlessly, taking your life and everyone else's into the hands of your subconscious mind, right? But then the other piece of this that we experience is the conscious piece, and I use the analogy of a judge, and this is slow, deliberate, effortful. Like a judge, it deliberates, trying to make careful decisions, in contrast to the unconscious piece that's like a gator making snap decisions, lurking below the surface of conscious awareness, and it's constantly scanning for opportunities and threats, but it's super lazy. And that's the defining feature of an alligator compared to other animals. And they can, you might remember from the book, they can go up to 3 years without eating anything at all.
Right.
So when you're trying to influence somebody, if you predict that they will be like a gator, typically what that means is they will be so lazy, and the biggest likelihood of what's going to happen is that they do absolutely nothing and they continue on the status quo, or they ignore you. And the judge, I use as the analogy because it's like a human judge and it's biased. So it's trying to make objective, rational decisions, but it's biased, and it's largely biased by the gut reactions of the gator and emotions, biases, snap judgments, even though it's trying to do the right thing.
So the gator influences the judge.
Yes.
The other way around also, or?
Much less so.
Okay.
And even from a neurological perspective, these ideas are analogies and they're not anatomy, but there are far more neurons going from the primitive regions of our brain to the prefrontal cortex and the conscious decision-making parts than vice versa. And you can think about how, for example, the way you feel can influence the reasoning process through which you make your decisions, but you can't influence yourself to feel differently just by talking yourself into it.
Right. So the book seems to be part overcoming mental hurdles, internal fears that you may have, fear of rejection. You talked about diminishers, removing diminishers from our vocabulary. How much of being influential is mindset shift versus actions that we can actually take?
You said how much of being influential, and I like that you framed it in that way, because being influential is a much bigger and more enticing concept than just learning influence tactics or influence strategies. So while people find those manipulative, almost everyone says being influential would be great. And from my perspective, becoming influential is a process of personal development. And this is ultimately what has us becoming someone that people want to say yes to. And the strategies and the tactics are things that you can learn and you can practice, and they're awkward at first because you're not using them, and eventually, you get better at it, more skilled, it's less difficult. But then ultimately on this path of greater influence is you not using a lot of strategies and tactics, and just being present with people in a way that has them wanting to say yes. And you didn't have to remember, I should use this tool here and I should use that tool there. So I give the tools in the book, but the goal ultimately is that you don't use them very much.
So to get people to become that person that people want to say yes to, should we be talking to the gator or should we be talking to the judge, just in general?
Yeah, first to the gator. And then to the judge, because the gator is quick.
Yeah.
And always the first reaction is a gator reaction, and it biases the processing. So typically when we are smart, nice people trying to persuade someone and we don't want to push them or be manipulative, we jump to talking to the judge and giving them lots of facts and data and information. But they're going to process that according to what they already think, how they already feel, and they'll have a hypothesis that they're trying to support if they pay any attention at all. Right. But the likelihood is that they're just going to ignore us altogether. So always the first reaction to consider and try to influence is the gator. And it doesn't have to be that you need to have them feel emotionally invested. You don't need to tell some spectacular story or have them, you don't need to have them feel deeply emotionally connected, but a gator influence could look like making it easy for them to do something or making them not have to pay conscious attention. Right? So we don't always need to change somebody's mind to change their behavior. Often we don't.
And in the workshop, when you asked us what influence was, one of the things that I wrote down was changing people's minds. Do you see that as a goal of influence, or is it more about making things easy for your customer or your client?
When you talk about making things easy, you're trying to change a behavior, right? And when you talk about changing minds, if you need to or want to influence somebody's thinking, sure, that's a possibility. It is the hardest thing to do compared to influencing somebody's behavior. And the mistake, not you, but a lot of people make is thinking, in order to change their behavior, I need to change their mind. Instead of understanding, actually, first of all, their behavior may be a lot easier to change than changing their mind. But secondly, I want to influence all the people who disagree with me, right? Rather than if there's some topic or issue or project that I care about, where I should really focus, the low-hanging fruit, is people who are already interested or open-minded, activating them to take action and influence their behavior. And then when you need to try to change someone's mind, to have the respect that to acknowledge you don't want people to change your mind. They probably don't want you to change their mind, and you're probably not going to succeed. Once in a while, you will, but conversion happens in relationships. It doesn't happen in a conversation.
It's that's a good segue, because one question we've been talking about actually yesterday we were talking about relationships in one of our meetings, and I think our boss said the role of business is creating relationships, which is probably a general statement, but I wonder how techniques for being more influential might help with building those relationships.
This topic is essentially why I wrote this book and why I teach influence the way that I do, because otherwise there are just a ton of books and courses and things out there on influence, but the majority of them focus on these kinds of tactics that you can use to try to get something from someone in a particular transactional situation. But for most of us, what we really want is to be able to influence people in relationships and build relationships, and that requires that the wanting to say yes part, rather than just I'm going to try to get you to do something. Also, if you didn't want to say yes, then chances are you're going to try to get out of it, and that's not going to be fun for me either. So essentially the whole book is influence in the context of building healthy relationships, but one tiny specific thing that can be helpful for people to keep in mind is that when we're talking about the gator brain and you're meeting somebody for the first time, it's later times too, but thinking about first impressions, there are two social judgment dimensions that universally, just about all the time, we're making unconscious judgments on warmth and competence. So we're asking ourselves, gator brain says, do I like that person and do I respect that person? Let me just ask you, is it more important to you to be liked or respected?
Respected.
Yeah, me too. And most people. And what ends up happening is because we want to be respected, we focus on trying to seem smart, put together, giving lots of information, analysis, data, and we lean toward the judge part. Because do I respect this person is a bit more of a judge kind of thing. The gator part, on the other hand, is the vastly more important piece. So we think also that other people understand if we like them. But we only feel our liking for them, right? Like we talked about this morning, and the liking gap. And the liking gap, by the way, is that people like you 12% more than you realize.
That's good to hear.
And when we're building a relationship, first of all, to know that my cues about liking someone are generally not coming across, so I need to actively, intentionally display warmth if I like that person. And especially if we're talking about a virtual environment, or especially just writing, compared to hearing our voice. So you might be able to hear in my voice, you have a better chance of understanding that I like you. If you see my face, you can see that I'm smiling. But if I'm just writing texts and messages and emails to you, research finds, what you would not be surprised about, that people perceive less warmth than senders intended in messages, and they perceive more aggression than senders intended. So we have to be mindful about the warmth piece of it.
Adding exclamation points to the emails.
I do that. Yes. Like, it depends what your style is,
Right.
but I totally do that.
Yeah.
Although it's things like exclamation points and emojis and stuff are it's complicated when you're thinking of power dynamics,
Right.
because those are low power ways of expressing yourself.
Okay.
Right? And so for you and for me, it's fine. And most of the time, partly because we do have some power, it's fine if people are not perceiving us as in a dominant role. Actually, are you familiar with Chris Voss's work on negotiation?
No.
Actually, is this Chris Voss? No, FBI hostage negotiator. But I'm thinking of another FBI guy named Robin Dreek. He does work on rapport building, which is exactly relevant to the relationship building we're talking about.
Right.
And his job has been, for many years, training FBI agents to recruit spies to spy on their own friends. And so rapport building is a tremendously important piece of this.
Right.
And in trust building, his number one thing is that you don't ever try to dominate, and you come from a low power position. Like, even like if we're going to shake hands, like I would put my hand out in an open way instead of like the Donald Trump or Putin like kind of thing, right? So the emoticons and things are a low power way to express warmth, which is usually fine. And it's just, if you are someone who feels like, oh, I don't know if my boss respects me, as an example, I wouldn't do the emoticons and emojis, but more, hey, find sincere, warm things to say in a professional way.
Right. Chapter 4 is probably my favorite chapter, charisma. And you talked about Prince, who doesn't love Prince, right? Do you have a favorite Prince song?
I think it has remained since I was 10, When the Doves Cry.
I'm a
How about you?
Pearls girl myself.
Yeah.
So, Prince and charisma, what can we take away from this amazing artist who, was able to transfix so many across the world? What can we take away from him and how he performed and drew people in?
One of the things that I find most compelling about Prince and his story is how shy and uncharismatic he was to begin with. And Warner Brothers lore says that when they first signed him, the first time they saw him perform live, he not only wasn't electrifying the audience, but it was the opposite. And he was so shy. He could sing and he could play music, but when he would talk, he would barely speak above a whisper. And while he was playing, he just slowly turned until his back was facing the audience. So they said, listen, we will sign you. We love your music, but you are never going on tour. Oh. And so he had a #1 Billboard hit, I Want to Be Your Lover. No plans for a tour until Rick James said, hey, do you want to be my warm-up act? So for Rick James' Super Freak Tour, Prince got to come, electrify the audience, but at the beginning he still sucked. And he was emulating Rick James, and he was seeing what it was that Rick James did to electrify the audience, where at first Prince was getting booed off stage, partly because he was just way ahead of the curve in gender non-binary stuff, like wearing women's underwear and stuff, right? And by the end of the tour, Prince had learned how to put his attention on the audience and how to connect with people in the audience.
Yeah.
So when I finally got to see him perform in Vegas, and I wrote about the story that you read in the book, he was so connected that he walks on stage and I felt like he was looking directly into my eyes, and he says, "Are we alone?" And the woman next to me, total stranger, just falls to the ground in a dead faint. And I didn't blame her. I felt it too. And when the paramedics come, I said, like, "Oh my God, has this ever happened before?" And they said, "It's not the first time." So, and
he has that effect on people.
In hindsight, the stage lights and everything, he probably couldn't see either one of us.
Yeah.
But he shone in that way that we practiced this morning in our session,
Pause
focusing on, one person at a time. And even if you can't see them, you're sending your energy and your open heart and connecting with people one by one in the audience, like Justin did today.
Yeah, it was wonderful, by the way.
It was, yeah, I loved it.
And so I believe you called that connecting with one by connecting with many?
Connecting with many by connecting with one.
Okay.
Yeah, and many people in the room can feel that vicariously. Yeah. And for people who are already comfortable public speaking, the next level is to focus on people in the audience who are checked out. Mm-hmm. So the most difficult people to connect with are the people that when you get their attention and they feel you, then the audience is electrified.
So, we work with, as you know, lots of public speakers. And as a former actress, I think you have a really good take on this idea of pausing and shining. And in the book, you said there's 2 big secrets to stage presence. And so what does that look like for people who have to influence from a stage or from a public speaking setting?
Yeah, whether we like public speaking or not, as we rise in ranks of leadership, we get thrust into it, right? And if we're good at public speaking, then we're more likely to get promoted. When we are on stage or just in front of a group of people, the pausing that you mentioned is the simplest piece, and it's the most important piece, because it's like there's a time warp on the stage where time passes faster for the speaker than for the audience, and it's especially if you're nervous. So nervous speakers, you've seen and we've all seen, really, really fast, and the audience are like, oh, and then you get bored because you can't actually listen.
Right.
Every time a speaker pauses, then your attention can catch up. So for anyone who is concerned about nerves or feeling uncomfortable, just do that one thing. Just pause. And it can be, you can think of one beat, like an actor's beat, doesn't matter. One beat for a period, half a beat for a comma. And the first point to pause that can be really helpful is when you take the stage, you pause for one breath and then you begin speaking. And it's really cool for people who haven't tried it to experiment. And it feels very scary. It feels so scary to stand there saying nothing, feeling everyone in the room. But from the audience's perspective, that breath that you take is like a breath of fresh air. The mind quiets and comes straight to you.
Right. I just see all the eyes looking at me on stage, and that's where then the heart starts racing,
right?
And the mind starts racing. It's like, where are my words?
Yeah.
But I can see how that, just stopping, taking a deep breath, and then beginning would be helpful.
Yeah, and the focusing on one person. So, and when you say you make eye contact, you take a breath, and you say hi to that one person, and all of us will feel present, including you.
Amazing. Salespeople in business. You talk a lot about influence in those purposes. What are the common mistakes that companies and salespeople make when it comes to trying to persuade an audience?
So, can I just ask you, what is something that you find super annoying about salespeople trying to sell you stuff?
Probably the repeated emails or phone calls. I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. It's what we're supposed to do. But without me having expressed an interest in the product or service, and the coming back and then again, and the lack of personalization in it also, I think that's the annoying thing.
Yeah. So the without you having expressed an interest piece is really important here, right? And I think that from my interactions with you, you're good at responding on email. You know that I'm terrible at responding. And so I really appreciate it when I didn't get my act together to respond and you'll get back to me, right? Because I want you to be in communication with me. But people who are working in sales tend to be either way too aggro or way too passive. And the majority of people, even working in sales, are way too passive. And there's huge turnover, not just in jobs, but the industry. Most people can't hack it in sales for very long. When we talk about people asking and following up after they get a no, which is different than just bombarding, but after you get a no, the average person goes back 0 times to ask again. The average salesperson goes back 3 times after hearing no. But the master salesperson, the most successful salespeople, will go back 6 or 7 times. Now that sounds like what you just said you hate, right? But the difference is, first of all, I just said they're the most successful salespeople. Nobody's going to buy something from someone that they hate who bombarded them with 6 or 7 messages. So those people are only following up like that on first qualified leads. So somebody who they, in their perception, really might be someone to say yes, like at the very least they can, right? But then they're not just bombarding you, they're asking if it's okay. So they have a conversation with you, Whitney, and hey, here's this thing that I have to offer, and is this something that would interest you? And you explain, no, it's not a good time, we're at the end of the quarter, or no, I have another thing that I'm happy with right now. And they say, oh, okay, great, I'm glad you have something you're happy with. Would it be okay if I just checked back in with you, say in, a month, a year, whatever that is, just to see how it's going? I don't want to bother you.
Right.
And then you say, because this person was respectful and they took 2 of your seconds, you're like, okay, sure, yeah, don't ask me next month, but next year, it's fine if you check. And then they check back and they say, hey, Whitney, we talked last year and you said it was okay. So this part 2, reminding you said, either you said that it was okay, or sometimes they'll say, you asked me to follow up with you, and I'm just checking back in to say, are you still happy with that thing that you have? And at that point, you're like, oh, actually, no, they suck. And then this is the person who gets your business because they're following up after getting permission.
Right. So beyond sales and marketing, how do you see being influential and being persuasive and having these charismatic qualities? Why is it important, even outside of sales and marketing?
I believe influence, the ability to persuade other people and to have them be excited to say yes, is the way, not just the way that you've survived, because you had to, as a baby, like that's all that you could do, but this is the way that human beings have reached the level of global dominance as a species that we have, because it allows us to work together and it allows us to adapt. And so there's nothing about influence that's specific to the workplace, although that's how we think about it, but it's equally important, and the psychology is exactly the same when we're talking about our families or our communities or activism that we might want to do. Anything that's important and big is going to take a lot of people. And so influence is what we need to be able to bring those people together and get them motivated to take action.
Motivated to take action. That's, I think, the key, because the action part, I think, is where people probably get caught up. It's what to do. How can I do this? How can we accomplish this together? So how do I rally my troops, my people, to get on the boat that I'm trying to steer through the water?
Yeah, or even just to figure out what is the same page that we want to get on. Often as a leader, it's not that you have an agenda that everyone has to follow, but your job exactly is get everyone rowing in the same direction, right? And that's a big problem with many of the biggest problems, like let's say the climate crisis. There's so many different things that any one of us can do, and we look to leadership. Or when we have an economic crisis, right? We look to leaders to tell us this is where we row. And leaders can be getting all kinds of feedback about what the direction should be, but they bring us together and point us in the same direction.
So when you're advising companies on this subject matter, what's the thing that surprises them the most about what you're telling them is going to help them be more influential and achieve those goals?
There are a lot of different misgivings, but one of the things that sparks a lot of conversation and thought and then further discussion when we talk about it is this piece about asking an inequality and an asking gap related to privilege and power. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. But it's not hard to understand there's an idea that people with more privilege, like overprivileged people, are more comfortable asking than underprivileged people on whatever dimension we're talking about. And the kindest, best, most wonderful leaders tend to be saying yes whenever they can to people who ask them for help or resources or flexibility or whatever it is. And those well-intentioned, good leaders are contributing to inequality because they're passively, reflexively, reactively saying yes to those privileged people who ask. And they are not even thinking about all of the people with less privilege who aren't asking. And we talked this morning about some research finding that your position, your family's position on the socioeconomic spectrum determines whether you were likely to get training from your parents to ask or whether you were likely to get training from your parents to work hard and deserve merits. And maybe you've been told to work harder than other people to get ahead. So a lot of leaders go away from a conversation like that saying, wow, what does this mean for our policies? And what kind of practice should I be changing when all of our intentions are good, but they're creating inequality and injustice?
And that's it sounds like a cultural phenomena for a company, is to have that understanding that you can ask questions, that you can lead people in the right direction in a positively influential way.
Yeah, and also the idea that as we go down the influence path and gain more influence, it's also our job to help other people have more influence on that path. And so that's part of my mission too, to make influence and the science and the skills of it as concrete and simple as possible, so that it's not just that I can teach people this, but all of those people can teach people.
It's like a pyramid scheme for influence.
Yes. Yep. This is my MLM. Come on board, people.
Okay. So last question before we get into our lightning round. What's a question about your career, your work, your expertise that you wish people asked you that they just never ask you?
I think that I've done, I know that I did over 100 interviews in the past year. Yeah. So I was trying to think of like, what is a question that people don't ask you? And actually, there's one thing that has come up very rarely from conversations about the book. But would you ask me what's my favorite chapter?
Yes. What's your favorite chapter?
My favorite chapter is chapter 9, and this is toward the end of the book where it's wrapping up all of these big themes and skills and stuff that I've been talking about. And it tells the story of my now husband, who was a student in my class and ended up using these skills to change the course of history and ended up influencing democracy in the Middle East. That's so amazing. It's not a coincidence that I married him. I'm very, very inspired by him. Wonderful. His name is Belabas.
Wonderful. I hope to meet him one day. Bring it back when you come next time.
Okay.
Okay, so for our lightning round, 3 questions very quickly. First thing, use your gator. And this does have a women's history slant to it. So here we go. Who has been the most influential woman in your life?
Oh, very easy. My mama.
Wonderful. Why?
She sees the magic in life, and everybody wants to be part of that.
Wonderful, wonderful. What's the best piece of advice a woman ever gave you?
Oh, well, I guess I'll go with my mom again. And what she's taught me is to find my joy in other people's success. And when I learned how to do that, then my own happiness, my possibilities for happiness became limitless.
Wonderful. And lastly, what advice would you give to young women today? Given all the things that we have going on, what would you tell young women today? Or women in general? We can block it out.
Yeah, no. That you will mess up.
Mm-hmm.
You will mess up, and you'll mess up a bunch of times, and you'll never stop messing up. So don't have your bar be, I can't mess up.
Yeah.
Just have your bar be, I didn't die, I didn't kill anyone.
Yeah.
And not even I didn't get fired. Like, maybe sometimes you'll get fired. I've been fired 3 times.
Okay.
But just
it's like the biggest fear in life, but that right there, being fired.
embrace the mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Embrace the mess. I like that. So tell us where we can find you online.
ZoeChance.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with people. And you can email me if you want at friends@ZoeChance.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Influence
you.
is Your Superpower is probably the best book I read last year, and I'm keeping it on my shelf so I can go through it at least once a year. But I've definitely found it to make me think differently about what's going on in my head and how that comes off to other people. So thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. And anyone who does decide to buy the book, you don't have to. You can get it at your library. But 50% of my profits are going to fight the climate crisis.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank
Zoe.
you.